Geez, it's the end of the season. The Abu Dhabi Grand Prix round 19 of the World Championship concluded over the weekend, and thus rounding out the 2015 Formula One World Championship. But still plenty to discuss, nevertheless. Still a lot to get through, I guess, over the next few weeks. Of course, we're going to talk about the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix in detail in this edition, and then in the following weeks we'll review the season that's gone past, which, as we've said on previous editions, has been a bit of a phantom season. We haven't really had the excitement consistently throughout it as in previous seasons, but nevertheless we'll get straight into it. And as always, I'm Jawad Yaqub. Joining me is Baden Westerweller. And how do we feel after the weekend? It was certainly a lively occasion for the group of us, but certainly the race didn't live up to expectation.
It's a weight off the shoulders to have the season done and dusted, as much as the fair share of its highlights, as you did mention. Really, it was quite lackluster on the whole. So just to officially have that conclusion, and means we can have that closure, have a bit of downtime, and just chew on really what we can glean from the season. There was still plenty that did go on there, so it's just be nice now to really be able to turn our attention to hopefully bigger and better things in 2016.
Yeah, and later on in the this episode, we'll be talking about Fernando Alonso, the curious case of, and what he'll be doing in 2016, as well as taking a look at the postseason tyre test that was conducted at the Yas Marina circuit overnight. 12 hours and over 1,000 laps completed for Pirelli to gather data for their 2016 compound of tyres. But the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, first of all, Nico Rosberg completes his first career hat-trick of victories. He claimed his 6th consecutive pole position as well. And really, it's been interesting how he's really had it over Lewis Hamilton in the last 3 races. I mean, we've argued, and other people have argued too, that perhaps Hamilton has checked out since winning the title in Austin, or is it genuinely the car suits Rosberg now? Hamilton's hinted at changes in the balance of the car and the setup, which favours his teammate more, but he really has. Rosberg led the race from pole position, no challenge from Hamilton, but Hamilton again was upset by the strategy calls of his team. He was a bit irked by it, we could say. He ended up pitting 10 laps later after Rosberg on the second stint to gain an advantage, but it was to no avail, as Hamilton claims, that the team didn't give him a choice over which tyres he could use at the end, but the team say that they did. So another conundrum within the team, and a lot of people, a lot of passionate Lewis Hamilton supporters certainly have been very vocal about why aren't the team letting him use open strategy? An issue that didn't really come up until the last few races when Rosberg has been winning.
Yeah, certainly these strategy calls have been in sync with the resurrected Nico Rosberg ever since Lewis Hamilton took out that title at Austin. It's really still up for debate whether it is a case of Nico upping his game or Lewis simply just putting that cue in the rack until next season. But the reality is they've got a winter for them in Europe to simmer on these little issues, and we're not going to know for sure until Albert Park. But even then, the early to mid stage of the season, whether this is really a renewed challenge from the Nico Rosberg we saw so flaringly throughout 2014. But when it comes to these strategies, of course, at Mexico, we saw Lewis. He was keen to continue. The pit wall told him to stop, and he abided. Brazil, there was similar sentiments from Lewis wanting to run an alternate strategy, and he was put into place. And then it's happened yet again this weekend, and he wasn't happy about it. But the ultimate outcome is, I guess, another 1-2 for Mercedes. And we did see post-race, indeed, to that end, Nico saying how he was pretty happy with himself to have won 3 consecutive races, whilst Hamilton snided back, oh, well, he's a 3-time world champion, so it's hard to top it. And they've both got their corners to punch from, but they've got now, best part of 4 months to just sit on it and see how it galvanizes them for 2016.
But do you reckon it's a case of Hamilton just being throwing the toys out of the basket now that he hasn't been in the favourable position? I mean, the way that Mercedes strategy works, and it has worked for many years, if you've been closely following the Mercedes team, which I know you did, Baden, when Michael Schumacher was around, is that they have the same strategy for both drivers. And before, you didn't really take notice of it until they started dominating. And now that they dominate and both cars are fighting for the win and fighting for the championship, their philosophy on strategy is that whoever's the leading driver will get first call, but both drivers ultimately will be on the same strategy. So that means they'll pit. If one guy pits on this lap, the other guy will pit on the lap later, and he'll go onto the same tyres as well. So we didn't really hear Rosberg complain about strategy much when he was finishing second to Hamilton all season. But do you reckon it's just a case of Hamilton just throwing the toys out of the basket, going back to what I said before?
It does raise that question again. Just the state of play as things are. Who knows? We've heard a few things too about Hamilton's off-track escapades. Whether that's starting to affect him a little bit on track, just causing that added pressure. But he's really a man who should be driving with the really weightlessness there, having achieved all of the objectives he's after. Of course, that third world title is the one he said which would fulfill his ambitions when he commenced his career there. But still being seen, yeah, he's been quite irked, and Rosberg's looking like the cool customer the last few races. It's just really, though, as we can't state enough, dead rubbers the past three, so wipe this slate clean for Lewis. And if he comes out at Melbourne all guns blazing, then not too many people are going to recall this little episode, regardless of any of this talk about reviews by the Toto Wolff and the like about just that little change in dynamic that we've seen really since he secured that title.
Very much so. But moving it on, Kimi Raikkonen consolidated third, and his third podium of the season. And believe it or not, he started third. So a lot of number threes for Kimi Raikkonen. But it was a solid drive, you have to say, from the Finn, who a lot of criticism has come upon him all season long, saying that, oh, why don't you qualify? He's not qualifying good enough. But then when he does qualify close to the pointy end, he hasn't converted. But he's got that podium. While Seb, his teammate Sebastian Vettel, has won 3 races, Raikkonen's got 3 podiums to his name. And he himself has admitted that it hasn't gone all to plan this season. But to get a good result like that to round out the year must give him a lot of confidence going into next season. And Sebastian Vettel too finished 4th despite his starting out of 16th position. So another solid drive from the sister Ferrari of Raikkonen as well. And great drives from both of them, you have to say. And Ferrari really looming as the equal challengers to Mercedes-AMG going into 2016, as many have mooted.
Absolutely. To think where they were 12 months ago, we had a disconsolate Fernando Alonso there, and we keep harking back to that notion, which will be highlighted when we discuss your impending article, just that he left Ferrari because he was sick of finishing second. I'm pretty sure he'd rather Ferrari and their triumvirate of victories and regularly on the podium and dicing for the lead over the debacle of McLaren. Yeah, it's surely a bit more of a desirable position. And to see the strides they made this season, and especially the last few races, they really seem to have made a few more inroads, even if they couldn't get the job done P1 for next season. With the natural progression, it's going to be very surprising if they're not more or less, as you say, Mercedes equals. And Sebastian Vettel, he's looking renewed after that Red Bull fizzer of a season 2014. He looked like a man out of place, and he's regained that passion. And he doesn't need much more now incentive there to really take the fight right up to. We mentioned earlier, really, it was just going to be Lewis Hamilton. But if Nico Rosberg can sustain the form of the past few events, we could have a 3-way battle for the title. And then who knows about Kimi, if he can really get himself back into gear next season. It's really looming as exciting times.
Very much so. But Kimi's third place also allowed him to clinch 4th in the Drivers' Championship, but this was largely aided too by a poor race for his compatriot Valtteri Bottas, who he was fighting over that 4th position in the championship for. Bottas had a poor start to begin with, but then it also met with a unsafe release in the first pit stops into the path of Jenson Button, who claimed that it was a avoidable incident, and he saw they should have seen it coming, the Williams team, but the Finn ended up getting a 5-second penalty, which he had to serve in his next pit stop, and ultimately he finished in 13th and outside of the points. So not a good race, not a very good race for Williams again. We've seen them taper as the season has gone on. They've only had, I think, the 3 or 4 podiums compared to the flurry of podiums they had in the back half of 2014, but going to have to move on now into 2016, and hopefully they can be back up there. Felipe Massa finished in 8th, of course, 4 points for him on that occasion, but Williams have conceded a lot of points, and nevertheless they still finished 3rd in the Constructors' Championship, which is the same where they finished last year, but they were really hoping to have gone one better this season, haven't they?
Now, Abu Dhabi was a microcosm of their season, which promised so much and delivered so little. So many of those opportunities were taken away. And for the umpteenth time, I'll highlight Silverstone there. 1-2 became not even a podium berth in the end. How that one slipped through their fingers. It really just epitomised just the way that their indecision just to make these decisive calls on the fly, which we've seen the leading outfits do so just so professionally, and it's rewarded them greatly. For Williams, though, we really thought they were the ones taking it to Mercedes, and who knows where they'll be next season, whether they can lift their game up and be at the Ferrari level of this season, or whether they're just going to stagnate and perhaps Red Bull or one of those other midfield teams is going to assume that best of the others outside of the 2 big teams as it is now. But really, 3 podiums was it overall, couple for Bottas, and considering he was in contention for that Ferrari drive mid-season, unless he lifts his game next year, he's going to stagnate a bit in terms of his career progression.
Yeah, the natural way will be to go up, and if Williams are not the way up, then he'll have to, I guess, another team. But we've said how competitive the driver market is, even though everything has sort of settled down for 2016. It's really 2017 when those contracts are up, and there'll be a lot of movement on hand. But we'll move on to Force India now, and another solid drive for Sergio Perez for 5th position. I think he's finished 20 points ahead of his teammate Nico Hulkenberg in the championship, which is a fair margin. He had that podium, of course, at the Russian Grand Prix as well. So, I mean, we're talking about Bottas before and how he'll be in line for perhaps getting a promotion in 2017 to another team. What about Sergio Perez? He's really staked a claim for himself in this back half of 2015. I mean, he was recovering last year from the awful season he had with McLaren, and he copped a lot of criticism, being too young in that, in a top team like that. But ever since he came to Force India, he really has rejuvenated himself. And Nico Hulkenberg's no pushover, just to say the least. He is a very, very highly rated driver. A lot of people have him high on their shopping lists as well for the silly season. But for Perez to come in, beat him by 20 points in a season, it does say something about the young Mexican.
Oh, who knows? Maybe a Ferrari reprisal, as we did see, was being lined up many years ago. He'd be very much back in the radar. End of 2016, of course, along with Verstappen and Ricciardo and the like there. If he continues this upward trend, then he's got to be a factor there. Even Mercedes themselves might be having a close look, and he'll just be glad that he got out of that sinking ship that is McLaren. That really was a massive misstep in his career from the way he'd been going those early days at Sauber. But just quickly on Hulkenberg, I guess he can rest his laurels on that little breakthrough victory he might have had in the middle of France in a Porsche. That's some consolation. Nevertheless, we've seen him always struggling to make that real breakthrough, those issues about his height being a factor. But if Force India, they've really come along hugely since that B-Spec car came on track around Silverstone time, and we've heard the rumours too about Aston Martin and the backing from their organisation. If that really delivers more inroads, then that both of these drivers could be podium contenders, and who knows if they'll be in a position to make that real breakthrough top step of the podium.
Yeah, very much so. And Hulkenberg finishing seventh in that race there. But going back to what you said about Aston Martin, we haven't really heard much about them since the initial calls came around Mexico time. So that'll be one to watch for over the pre-season or even just the post-season now. But in between the Force Indias was Daniel Ricciardo. He finished sixth, but ultimately he did lose P7 in the standings to his teammate by 3 points. It's been a tough year, as we've detailed many times, for Red Bull and Daniel Ricciardo, particularly after the high of 2014, sorry, beating his four-time World Championship winning teammate Sebastian Vettel, just trouncing him literally. And this year he lost his teammate battle by just a mere 3 points to Danny Kvyat, who I have to say, I guess he's flown under the radar really compared to the other Red Bull Junior drivers, but in the position that Kvyat's in, he's performed really well, and to beat his teammate by 3 points is a good achievement. And certainly if that car is a lot better next season, we can expect a lot from both Ricciardo and Kvyat.
Yeah, well, as we've talked about, really, it's pretty hard to draw a true barometer of where these drivers are at when it comes down to it. 3 points is fairly marginal, so in the literal sense. So it's not really as though we're going to sit back and say, oh, Ricciardo's got to lift his game, otherwise he's out the door.
No, not at all.
They've had one hand tied behind their backs this year, really. It was only that Hungary circa mid-season break when they got some uplift in form there, and even few and far between there. They've had constant reliability issues, and they've just made the most of the limited resources at their disposal. So hopefully they can have this engine problem sorted, and we can really get a full acquittal from both of them of just where their futures lie. Because with Ricciardo, he's still on the Ferrari radar, and Kvyat too. Who knows what future beckons for him, pending the whole Red Bull future.
Yes, and between the Red Bull drivers, in ninth place was Roman Grosjean, who, let's say, was, I guess, driver of the day, sort of. I mean, we talked about Vettel moving up the order quite a bit to finish fourth, but an emphatic drive from Roman Grosjean from 15th on the grid after getting that gearbox penalty late after qualifying. But in his final race for Lotus, I mean, we don't realise that Grosjean's been at Enstone for pretty much his entire career so far, and that goes as far back as I think even 2007 or 2008 when he was their reserve driver, I think. And then he obviously got the breakthrough drive in 2009 alongside Fernando Alonso, then spending that time on the sideline. He went and won the GP2 championship, and then in 2012 returned to the Formula One grid full time. So it was an emotional drive, I guess, for both the parties, for Lotus and Grosjean, as Grosjean is off to Haas next season. So, good stuff from Grosjean. And, of course, Lotus, Enstone, their future still up in the air over the Renault deal. They're waiting on CVC to sign off the historic payments or whatever, the historic team payment for them to actually come back. And it's there's a lot of uncertainty behind it.
Irrespective of that, it was just a nice way for both parties to sign off on their erstwhile association. Of course, there are these little whispers that in the future nothing might preclude him returning to Enstone in lighter times if the Renault backing is in place. We'll see where things shake out with his Haas tenure there, whether it leads to a Ferrari berth or whether he decides, if that doesn't eventuate, that he'd be safer to retreat to his well-known sanctuary there. Of course, you said he's almost got a decade-long association with the factory there. Then clearly they've got lots of good memories. He's not going to leave on acrimonious terms.
No, not at all. Anyway, it was an adventuresome race for Max Verstappen too, who ended up finishing way down in the order in 16th, but ended up having to take an extra stop for flat-spotted tyres, but also a couple of penalties as well. A time penalty for exceeding track limits when he was racing Jenson Button for 12th. He had to serve that. And then a further penalty, a drive-through penalty, was applied post-race for for the Dutchman ignoring blue flags, and I think it was Lewis Hamilton that was involved in that one. But he's ended the season, despite being Rookie of the Year and claiming quite a few accolades, he's ended the season as the driver with the most penalty points on his license, with 8 in total. And I think a few people as well were laughing that for once Pastor Maldonado doesn't have the most penalty points. It's someone else. So,
altogether, not too surprising. As an 18-year-old, he probably could have done far worse. He could have already earned himself a sanction mid-season. So these things are quite natural at his age, and I'm pretty sure over the off-season he'll hone his racecraft even more, and he'll come out Melbourne next year, and we'll see much more few and far between these little errors that are associated with someone who to him he was the best part of the season underage. So I don't think we can read a lot into it.
Yeah, but speaking of Maldonado now, it was a torrid drive for Fernando Alonso, first of all, but yeah, that was because he had that first corner mishap with Maldonado, who was the only retiree of that race. Unfortunate for the Venezuelan for two years in a row to retire from this race. Last year, that his Renault engine spectacularly gave way on fire, or got set on fire or whatever. But yeah, first corner stoush with the Venezuelan, but the Spaniard funnily was pretty fuming. He was not pretty fuming. What am I saying? I'm losing words now. Damn it. Yeah, he was fuming over the penalty, drive-through penalty, which he copped because he was claiming that it was Sauber's Felipe Nasr who punted him into the Lotus to begin with, and Alonso was just, calling the FIA all sorts of things. They should be focusing on other things rather than giving him stupid penalties. And we're going to talk about Fernando Alonso, of course, next up. But Alonso ended up finishing 17th. Button finished 12th, as we said. In between them, we had the Saubers led by Ericsson in 14th. And then Will Stevens ended up beating his returning teammate, Roberto Merri, to 18th place. And Roberto Merri finished a lap down as well. So interesting to see that. Will Stevens obviously fighting potentially, and Roberto Merri, for a seat at Manor the next season. But before we sign off with the race review, we'll take a look at the championship standings. And Lewis Hamilton, of course, finishing 381 points. And the margin to Nico Rosberg, 322. It's not as huge as it was when Lewis wrapped up the title. Obviously, Nico winning 3 races on the trot has helped him out, and he got himself a nice margin over Sebastian Vettel too, who for some time we thought might be threatening that second place in the standings for him. We see Kvyat 3 points ahead of Ricciardo in 7th. Of course, Bottas finishing behind Kimi Raikkonen. Hulkenberg ended up securing 10th. And Jenson Button finishing 5 points ahead of his teammate Fernando Alonso. In the Constructors' Championship, we've got Mercedes on a record 703 points in the lead, back to Ferrari's 428. Force India with a decent margin, sealed out 5th. Lotus ahead of Toro Rosso as well, and McLaren missing out on 8th from Sauber. So we'll discuss more of this stuff, I guess, next week when we review the season and talk more about the season at large. But we're going to move it on now to the curious case of Fernando Alonso. And it was no secret that over the weekend in Abu Dhabi they were discussing claims of perhaps him taking a sabbatical next year if the car's not good enough. And would you care to recite the quote from McLaren's Ron Dennis for us?
At this moment in time, our drivers of next year are Fernando and Jenson Button.
Yeah, so Ron initially said that he's open to the idea of a sabbatical, but McLaren had to quickly turn around and say that we clarify that Button and Alonso will be driving next year. But the notion still stands that perhaps Alonso could, and I think you suggested this too, that Alonso could test the car, the MP431, in February, and if it wasn't to his liking, that he could make a decision then. And what do you think about this? I mean, of course, he's he's had a tough year, you have to say. As I said before, he was beaten by Jenson Button by 5 points, but yeah, Alonso is easily one of the best drivers on the grid, and to see him back there is not a very good image for the sport, is it?
Yeah, I mean, loss if he did depart from the grid, even if it is only for 12 months. But it does leave open that possibility that he'll enjoy that life away from the circuit if he moves on to another category, such as quite naturally the World Endurance Championship. He
which
might
is
like it so much that it's a permanent move. But
Yeah, which his good friend Mark Webber is dangling like a carrot in front of him pretty much all the time. And Webber as well had a few words to say that he thinks these are ticking time bomb. Give him 2 or 3 days in the car, and if it's uncompetitive, I think he'll have a year off. So Webber, obviously knows Alonso a bit better than we do, and he might know more. But the thing is, there is no seats available in the WEC next year. They've announced last week that Audi and Porsche will not be taking third cars with them to Le Mans, and each team will have an unchanged lineup. So it doesn't look like Alonso might even race next year, let alone go to Le Mans. So,
that
but
might be what he needs. He might be so senile from what he's had to endure that he needs to be wheeled off to the retirement home for rehabilitation, and he'll come back at the end of November and see where things are at. And if there's no improvement, then well, as I keep mentioning, he might look at his alternatives. Maybe Enstone will be an attractive notion yet again. But
in a few
I think
in
from
a
Ron's
few
point of view, that the money factor, he certainly wouldn't be averse to casting Fred aside for 12 months, saving that change until he can really convince investors that they want to be putting their money where their mouths are, and seeing a sustained effort with Honda. But at this time, as Ron says, at this moment in time, Fred will be there. So unless things change as they're quite at liberty to do so in Formula One, this one's an open book.
Yeah, and but going back to also a lot of criticism has come to Alonso for his ill-timed career moves, as we say. I mean, there's a lot of emphasis put on being at the right place at the right time, and we look at examples of Lewis Hamilton and Sebastian Vettel, how they timed their moves from which were seen as their mainstay teams. Hamilton was seen as being McLaren's boy, and Vettel was seen as being Red Bull's boy. And it seems at the right time they've timed their moves perfectly, and they're enjoying success at their new homes. But Alonso, every time he's made a move, like from Renault to McLaren in 2007, that didn't pan out so well, leaving on bitter terms with them. And then back to Renault for a few uncompetitive years where he couldn't challenge for the championship. And then those 5 long years at Ferrari where the best he could do was second place. So, yeah, now to McLaren, and he's had his worst ever season to date in Formula One. So, where does it leave him? And you can understand if he's disgruntled, but it would be great. It'd be a great injustice to have him in the doldrums again, or to leave altogether. So to see him even at the back of the grid again next year will be a great injustice to the sport. And as many have said, many who don't even follow the sport, for example, asked me, why is Alonso at the back of the? Why is is he doing poorly now? But it's hard to explain that. Oh, it's actually the car. So a lot of people see it as a sport where the driver has the most influence, but when they see someone like an Alonso or a Button at the back, they get confused and think that perhaps they're not doing as well. But it's actually the car that they have is so shocking that you can't even see their ability almost.
To that end, no one would blame him or begrudge him if he did decide to cut his losses. Of course, he's still had an illustrious career as it is. It ultimately it's a poor reflection the way that the past 2 or 3 seasons have transpired. But if he's not going to be in any position to, I guess in the short, medium term, he doesn't want to endure another, say, 2 years of what we've all witnessed so emphatically in 2015, then if he wants to sail off into the sunset and pursue his business interests or his cycling ideas that were quite touted for a while there, then good luck to him there, because he's certainly set for life on the financial front, and he's still got plenty of good memories there, and he might hope he just doesn't want to tarnish them even more with a sinking ship as it is for now at McLaren.
But you think a racer of his caliber, he's one of the best drivers on the current grid. He has that ability to extract the maximum out of any given package to win races, and we've seen that in the past. And he's a winner of 32 Grand Prix and two titles. I mean, it's almost odd not seeing him there putting the pressure on Lewis Hamilton, because you think perhaps if he was in that Ferrari, even this is being outlandish, but perhaps he could push it to its limit to push Hamilton. And it's sad not to see both Vettel and Alonso going at Hamilton. And I think, a lot of people, Hamilton must be complacent that he hasn't had a big of a challenge from anyone this season. And now that he sees Rosberg stepping up his game, he does seem a little tetchy. So imagine if we have Vettel and Alonso and Rosberg challenging him for the title. It would be it'd be quite something. But it's nice of you also to point out that his most recent victory was 3 seasons ago, in 2013 at the Spanish Grand Prix at his home, and that was quite early on in the season too. It was only round 5 of the championship. So it's been a long time between drinks for Fernando. So it'll be interesting to see what happens next. And of course, you keep talking about that romantic idea of him returning to Enstone. If they do become Renault and they are at the forefront, perhaps it could be a good way for him to sign off his season, if he doesn't do it prematurely, of course. But we'll see what happens, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's his decision. He's got a lot to ponder there, and the next few months are pivotal to where that pathway leads. But 2015, it's going to be one that people are going to look back on and just think, what on earth happened for them to just misfire so spectacularly? They've got to have misjudged something there, both parties, McLaren and Honda, just to have almost gone backwards since the start of the year. And that's saying something, because they were in the abyss pretty much this time 12 months ago at that first test. The writing was on the wall that it was going to be an arduous year ahead. And it's hard to extract any highlights from that season. So for Fred, it's up to him.
Yep, and speaking of McLaren, Honda, and their pace, is it a bit of a surprise to you then? And now we're moving it on. That Stoffel Van Dorn, the young Belgian driver, is finished at the top of the timesheets in that 12-hour test we had yesterday at the Abu Dhabi circuit for Pirelli. He completed 99 laps, and one thing to point out also is that the teams were not allowed to bring any extra parts. They were exactly the same cars as they were at the end of the Grand Prix on Sunday, and the only difference is that they were all running anonymous sets of tyres. So what do you think?
Oh, it's all bluster until that pre-season first test next year in February. People are just going to look at that and think it's just a bit of a humorous postscript to a year that was Mercedes domination. No one's going to recognise McLaren as having topped this. Who knows if it's one of the tyres that suits their car specifically. That could be a possibility, but there's no chance on earth they're going to have found 2.5 seconds in the space of a couple of days.
No way. They as I said, they're the same cars as finished the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. No differences whatsoever. But anyway, talking about the test, the whole point of the test was to allow Pirelli to test out the 2016 compound tyres, and as we know, they're bringing a new compound as well, the Ultra Soft, which the Pirelli say is an aggressive choice for street circuits. They want to use that instead of the super softs on tracks like Monaco and also Singapore. But what Pirelli's chief Paul Hembry wants is to bring back that cliff, to not to have the tires, drop off. You have to feel as if you've got that cliff there, as we've seen in previous campaigns, and also to increase the number of stops during races. Now, does this mean that we're going to see a lot more tyre management and not achieving the maximum, or are we going to see them achieve the maximum but stop multiple times during a race? Because most races this year they've seen 2 stops or even 1 stop on some occasions.
El Hembry did cite that 2012 campaign as a bit of a template for them to base their construction moving forward, and that infamous quote from Michael Schumacher that the Pirelli rubber was like driving on raw eggs. If that's going to be what we see back in the 4 next season, certainly the drivers are going to have their hands full. But it's an element that it's been a bit wanting in previous seasons. After all that criticism they came in for, especially post that the infamous 2013 British Grand Prix. Who can forget the amount of tyres flailing through the air and nearly taking drivers' heads off? That was really quite a sight. And but it's going to increase maybe an extra stop per race for each car. Then good on them, because there's going to be no refueling, of course. That was not very popular. So another little dimension to the mix. It can't be a bad thing.
Yeah, it can't be a bad thing at all. But we see a couple of those smaller teams taking this opportunity to trial out young drivers. We have seen Hong Kong's Adley Fong before in a Sauber last season, but he's back behind the wheel of a Sauber. We see Alfonso Teles, actually, the young Mexican driver who's actually going to be Force India's development driver next season. He was there, and actually it was interesting seeing as the Manor team has not yet actually decided its drivers. 2 of the candidates that have been talked about quite a bit were actually behind the wheel. Rio Haryanto from GP2, and also Jordan King, whose dad is actually Justin King, is a major investor in the team. So perhaps those 2, we've talked a lot about them. You've talked about Haryanto a bit, having the funds to back up the team, and of course Jordan King's father is already a major investor within the team. So I guess for them it would have been a bit of an audition too, to see who will take those 2 seats at Manor next year.
Well, for a lot of these drivers, is as close as they're going to get to living the dream. So regardless of how little exposure these test sessions do have, that they've got to equip themselves when they are afforded these very rare opportunities. And certainly they're promising. Like, few of them there have that money as their primary purpose for the seat time. But you would say Haryanto has got what it takes, and of course Alexander Rossi's got to be in contention as well. Pascal Wehrlein, we've heard a lot about him being linked to a Manor imminently joining up with Mercedes there, so that would be a logical one there. So for these drivers, few and far between these opportunities, as we've seen since the Halcyon days of the mid-2000s, when you just bolt into the car and any old day and get behind the wheel and carve out some laps, and the whole world is watching. They're very anonymous now, these one-off tests at the end of the season, and that's all it is. Could separate you from F1 career, or that's it to, I don't know, forever. You're off to saloon cars.
Yeah, and anyway, Pirelli will be back in late January, of course, before the official pre-season starts for F1, to do a wet weather test at the Circuit Paul Ricard in France. And even still, Pirelli are unsatisfied that they've only been given a limited amount of time to test the tyres. And we've heard that in the past that the sort of deal breaker on their new contract was to have more testing time. And if they still feel unsatisfied, then they're going to have to try and negotiate more time, because for that wet weather test, we understand that they're going to have to use an older car too, the current hybrid spec
A
cars.
decade-old chassis, I heard. 10 years.
And what are you going to gather from that? I mean, it's not the best of indicators.
Then again, they were quite beastly, those 2005 spec cars. So if it has the pace on it, then perhaps it will be a good incentive for the actual grid when they are drawing up these 2017 regulations, and just they'll get really lustful for seeing a return of them in full capacity.
Very much so, but I think that's about all we had time for today anyway. We kept it nice and prompt, and now that the season's pretty much done and over with, we'll be able to reflect on it in detail from next week onwards. And then, yeah, we'll see what happens over the summer. Well, it'll be European winter, but for us, it'll be the summertime. And yeah, I mean, just before we conclude, do you have any words on the season at large? Just off the top of your head, you want to get across there, or?
I think just, yeah, the Ferrari resurrection is always a good thing for Formula One, but obviously it's still quite raw. So when we've had a bit more time just to digest what has been a few more not has beens than have beens in terms of spectacularness and the like. There'll still be a few things that we can extract once we've poured through them with a bit more detail, and we'll assess each team and each driver and just give a bit of an appraisal of what they got out of their seasons and what we think they can achieve going forward.
Yeah, and still we have no news on the Red Bull engine situation, if when's that going to be confirmed, and also Renault as well. That's a big one to tick off. But anyway, that's enough for this week. I reckon we'll sign off on that note. And yeah, from me, Jawad, and from Baden, thanks for joining us as always. And we'll see you for our season review next week. Goodbye.